You're listening to the Colts Blue Zone Podcast with Mike Chappell and Dave Griffiths.
Hello and welcome to the Colts Blue Zone Podcast. I'm Matt Adams with a game recap here for the Indianapolis Colts versus the New York Giants, a game that the Colts lost. 45-33 was the final score of that one. Now, usually the day after the Colts play, I do a recap podcast. I play audio from Shane Steichen and usually the starting quarterback, which sometimes is Anthony Richardson, but this week would be Joe Flacco. I'm not going to do that this week. They didn't have much to say that was worth noting. Their news conferences were both extremely short, probably due to the nature of the game and the way the Colts lost this one. Giving up 45 points to the New York Giants, absolutely inexcusable. I think everybody will tell you that on that team. The tackling was atrocious. You know, the Colts all season long have struggled to put together a complete game. When the offense does well, the defense buckles. When the defense plays well, the offense falls short. And then there's always that wild card of the special teams. And, you know, while the Colts did some good things on offense this week, we had a 100-yard game from Jonathan Taylor, who had a couple of touchdowns and a long touchdown run again. Had really nice games from Alec Pierce and Michael Pittman Jr., both with more than 100 yards receiving this week. You got a 300-yard game from Flacco. Even though they did those good things, they were negated a bit by things they did that weren't so great, such as Jonathan Taylor on a 3rd and 2 just sort of going out of bounds casually without picking up the first down and then getting stuffed on a 4th down play. Flacco had the offense moving on the first possession of the game, then got a little pressure up the middle. Of course he did, right? You know, that's going to happen from time to time. He tries to throw the ball away, but he's not able to get enough on it, and that ends up getting intercepted inside the red zone. And so just a kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back approach on the offense. Mostly consistently they were able to move the ball, but then there was like a 3rd and 8, I think, somewhere along there was a 3rd down play. They decided to run the ball, and that set up a 54-yard field goal for Matt Gay, which he missed. Those points would have come in handy at the end of this game. So you had a special teams fail there. And then they also gave up a 100-yard kickoff return to start the second half, just as they had sort of clawed their way back into the game, scored very close to right before the half. They proceeded to shoot themselves right in the foot. And this was just one of the sloppiest performances, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And then you had those special teams blunders, the missed field goal, and the kickoff return. And you just had, when Chap and I previewed the game last week, we said essentially Malik Nabers is the guy you've got to worry about, right? This is the one guy on the team that can hurt you. He's an exceptional talent. There have been reports that, when the Colts tried to move up in the first round of the draft last year, they got Latu, right? They wanted to move up and get an offensive player. And the guy that they really wanted, according to some team sources, was Malik Nabers. And my goodness, you can see why, right? Because you get that guy the ball in space, you make him miss a tackle, he makes you miss a tackle, and he just goes. And he can make great catches, long catches too. Just an incredibly skilled offensive player. And he was the only thing that the Giants had going for them. This was a team that had lost 10 games in a row. They hadn't won a home game all season. As a matter of fact, even after this game this week, the Colts have as many wins at MetLife Stadium as the Giants do because the Colts beat the Jets earlier this year. The Giants had scored a combined 52 points in their previous 4 games. 20 points, 11 points, 14 points, and 7 points. And the Colts surrendered 45 to these guys. They made Drew Lock look like first-team All-Pro. And it comes with the soft zone coverage that we have come to have to bear with, and it has come with the poor tackling. I mean, and no pressure. The Colts decided to run it back this season. They finished 9-8. They had Gardner Minshew as their quarterback. And we all know that Gardner has his limitations, but he played well enough to get the Colts into the playoff picture. And if they had been able to convert a 4th-and-1 play last year, maybe they get into the playoffs, right? And I think that enticed everybody to believe that with Shane Steichen back as coach, we make a few tweaks to the roster, right? That this team will be able to compete, maybe get a 9-8, 10-7, eke into the playoffs with the development of their quarterback, their young quarterback, as the main thrust of everything that's going to happen this season. And it could not have gone more poorly for the Colts this year. This was an inconsistent football team. They had a good record against bad teams and a bad record against good teams. And I do not understand how, they got a break when the Cincinnati Bengals botched multiple opportunities to win their game against the Broncos on Saturday. And that game ended up going, into overtime, and the Bengals finally ended up winning. And I mean, they doinked a field goal. They did they had poor clock management. They did everything they could do to lose that game against the Broncos, but still came out on top. And that was a break for the Colts, because if the Broncos had won, then the Colts had nothing to play for at all on Sunday. But the Bengals won, which meant the Broncos lost, which meant if the Colts could win this week, they still had a chance. They still needed help. They would have still needed help next week. But they still had a chance at getting into the postseason. So they had something to play for. The Giants, on the other hand, had won only 2 games this season. They'd lost 10 in a row. Their quarterback situation has been awful. They parted ways with Daniel Jones back near Thanksgiving, right? They'd been playing Tommy DeVito and Drew Lock, and they decided to go with Lock this week. He was awful last week, 2 pick-sixes against Atlanta. This is a team that didn't really have much of an offense going except for Malik Neighbors. And, the defense is not great. It's okay in some categories, but mostly bad. They can't score points. They were averaging 14 points a game on the season, and essentially had the number 1 pick in the draft going into this week. Now they don't. They lost that by virtue of beating the Colts. And so this team did not have much to play for other than pride, other than, not wanting to finish their season without having won a home game, that sort of thing. That's what was on the line for the Giants. And probably some personal accolades as well. Neighbors, probably getting 100 catches for the season and hitting 1,000 yards because he was close to both those, marks for his rookie year. And he ended up accomplishing both of those things against the Colts. And the Colts, meantime, had everything to play for here. Now, again, even if they had won this week, they still need a lot of help. They needed Denver to lose a game, and they needed wins from Miami and Cincinnati in order to get into the playoffs. But they would still be there. That hope was still there. You win, you take care of business, you have to hope everything else plays out in a certain way. And for the Colts this week, to put out the effort that they put on the field there, to look like a team that didn't want to be out on the field, to look like a team that really, they looked more like we would expect the New York Giants to look, a team that had no hopes of making the postseason, a team that was looking, toward the quarterback evaluation of what's going to be coming up in the 2025 draft. The Colts have everything to play for here, but they played a very poor game. And I don't, I've talked about this before on the podcast, Shane Steichen and his pillars of preparation and resiliency, and we're going to be a competent football team. This was not a competent football team. This was not a football team that was prepared. They didn't tackle like it. They didn't play like it on defense. And sometimes on offense, they didn't even look very good. What are you doing running an outside sweep with Taylor on a play? I do not understand how the Colts tried to out-genius themselves this week with some of the play calls. And, Flacco's first interception, it's not inexcusable or anything like that, but it really, really hurt. They could have gotten some points there if they had just played sharper on defense. But, again, they gave up 45 points to the Giants. That's almost more than they had scored in the last 4 games combined. And they made Drew Lock look like an all-star, an all-pro, all-NFL caliber quarterback. And this is a guy that's had a rough NFL career. And it's not the first time we've seen a backup make it to the all-NFL team. The Colts have made over the past few years, the Colts have made, a real, they've made that into a trend. Taking these kind of scrub quarterbacks and making them look good for a week. And Drew Lock looked really good for a week. And it's just inexcusable. I don't know what you do in the front office, but somebody's got to be held accountable here. And whether is that going to be Shane Steichen? Is that going to be Chris Ballard? Are they going to move in a different direction with quarterback? I don't know. I mean, those are the three things that you're going to have to look at, and defensive coordinator. So I guess 4 things you're going to have to look at with the Colts going forward. I just don't. I have at times this season defended Gus Bradley because there have been times this defense has played well, and they have shown signs of playing well. They look prepared. They've created turnovers. They've caused some havoc in the backfield. And then there were those times where the defense would play well and the offense couldn't pick up the slack. It happened several times this year. An early example would have been the Green Bay game. Colts really shouldn't have been in that game. It was a 1-score game, and the offense was miserable, but the defense, created some turnovers. They caused some havoc, and that kind of kept Indianapolis in the game. And so that ended up being a 1-score game, and it had no business being. There were a couple of games this year that were like that. But to come out and play the way they did against just a punchless, for the rest of the season, a punchless New York Giants offense is absolutely inexcusable. And you've got to make changes. I think you've got to make changes at defensive coordinator. The front office discussion is one that owner Jim Irsay is just going to have. Because you look at Ballard's resume. They've got a sub-500 record with him as a GM. He's been around since 2017. Yes, Andrew Luck retired in August of 2019. We know, but it's 2024 now. And it took us forever to kind of settle in and decide what you want to do on quarterback in the first place. I think you've got to move on. They've been to the playoffs twice under Ballard. They've won 1 game. That was when Andrew Luck was quarterback. They made the other playoffs in 2020 when they brought in Phillip Rivers for a 1-year audition here. And then Rivers retired and became a high school coach, and that's fine. The Colts wanted him to play a year or two, and he didn't. And then they got brought in Carson Wentz. We know how that all ended. Matt Ryan, that was a disaster. The Jeff Saturday interim coach stuff. It's just not been clean. And I thought Shane Steichen would bring some consistency to this football team. I thought he would bring a tough-minded approach to this football team. I thought the Colts would be obsessed with football and obsessed with the details. But something's getting wrong. Something's wrong in the messaging or the approach, because if the players valued Steichen as much as they say they do, we would have gotten a much sharper, cleaner, better effort from this team in a game that meant something. I think that's the most alarming thing, and I've seen some of the other Colts writers equate this a little bit to the Jacksonville disaster, where the Colts, all they had to do, it really goes back to also being kind of a Raiders disaster as well. The Colts had 2 games left in their season. They needed to only win one of them to get into the playoffs, and this was the 21 season with Wentz at quarterback. And they lost to the Raiders, and they shouldn't have, but they did. And then they went to Jacksonville, which we all know the history of the Colts. Jacksonville and screwy things happen there and all that. But they had a chance to be a Jacksonville team that was terrible and didn't show up for that game at all either. And that was a different coaching staff, same front office, different coaching staff. And we still had all this just cannot get past themselves. Still the same thing. A game that meant something on the road against an opponent that was bad. This was a bad Giants football team. Don't let anybody kid you about this. I'm sure people are going to say, well, look, this is the team they could have been. No. This was a bad football team playing a mediocre Colts team that simply could not get out of its own way. And I just don't know, as I mentioned, I don't know where you go with this going forward. But the Colts spent a lot of money in the offseason. I know people say Ballard doesn't spend money, but he does. He just spends them on his own things, the players that he likes, that he's drafted and he wants to keep around. And, you're going to keep around guys like DeForest Buckner. You're going to keep guys like Kenny Moore, for sure. No doubt about that. But, one of the big changes the Colts did make last season, and a couple other people have pointed this out as well, one of the big changes the Colts made last season was they set a record for sacks as a team last season. But they got rid of the defensive line coach, Nate Ollie. They brought in Charlie Partridge in the offseason. And he was supposed to unlock this defensive line and bring them to a second level. Well, they are far, far short of where they were last year in terms of quarterback sacks. And when they needed a 3rd and 8, to put a little pressure on the quarterback, bring him down into drive, it just didn't happen. And this was a patchwork offensive line for the Giants that had been terrible this season. And the Colts can't get anything going against them. They had their pick of their first, since all those offensive players in the draft, this goes back to April, went off the board. The first 14 players were offensive guys. The Colts had their first pick at their first stab at any defender on the board that they wanted. They picked Laiatu Latu. And while he shows flashes from time to time, the consistency is not there, and sort of the Dwight Freeney-esque rookie season that we were hoping for never materialized. Freeney's first season, he kind of split time. He didn't play the first half of the season, and then it came to a point where they couldn't keep him off the field because he was disruptive. Now, it's a little bit different with Latu, but because he ended up kind of getting gang pressed into service on the defensive line probably earlier than the team would have liked because of some injuries, Samson Ebukam being primarily the one there. It kind of changed everybody's role on that line. And so Latu got pressed into to work a little bit earlier, but you would think that experience would then pay off down the end. He's supposed to be this polished pass rusher. But we're just not seeing the results. And when the results are not there, it has to do with the scheme, has to do with the way these guys are being coached, and you got to make some changes. And I think that's the long and short of it. The Colts are now 7-9 on the season. They have a chance to go 8-9 next week. And I don't think it's going to look great for them. They play Jacksonville. It'll be home game at least. But, at this point, it doesn't matter. And then you have all the questions about the quarterback situation. Do they bring Joe Flacco back for another year as a backup? Probably not. I think they probably move on from there. But maybe they do. Who knows? Richardson, I would assume, would have to be back. And then the team did him no favors this week. A lot of people criticized him for tapping out of that game earlier in the season. Then he got benched for a couple of games, and apparently that had to do with game preparation and focus or what have you, and now he was doing all the things right. Then Shane Steichen says he's a little sore this week. And because he's a little sore, he didn't practice. And because he didn't practice, he didn't play. And the only thing we had gotten from the team really was that he was sore. He's a little banged up. That was sort of the implication. He's a little banged up, but he's not going to be able to play this week. And then that makes people publicly question whether this guy's tough and capable of playing through injuries when this is a thing that he's had to do so far his entire career here in Indianapolis. But it was really back spasms. And there are very few situations in which I personally can empathize with a professional athlete, because I am. You may not have noticed, but I am not a professional athlete. Back spasms are miserable. Like, if you've ever had them in any shape or form, back spasms are a miserable injury to have, because you might take some muscle relaxers, but it may help, it may not, and then it may flare up at just the most inopportune times. Sometimes you can't hardly walk. You can't stand up. It's a terrible thing to have to do. But instead of just being straight with people because they wanted to be gamesmanship, they wanted to play a gamesmanship with this 2-13 football team on who the starting quarterback was going to be, Steichen just said, Richardson's a little sore. And the messaging, terrible. The public perception, terrible, because then it makes Richardson look like this is a guy who can't play through injuries and just refuses to play through injuries. If he's a little nicked up, he can't play. But it was back spasms. Just say it was back spasms. It's pretty simple. All right. So I really haven't talked a whole lot about the game. I've talked more about the organization as a whole and kind of the mess that the Colts are in. I know that last week when I was talking to Chappell, I was like, well, do you want to be one of these, 2-13 teams, or would you rather be the Colts with a chance to get into the playoffs? Maybe that's a better situation. I'm not sure that it is. And the reason we look so hard at the playoff picture is because that's what you hope for. You hope your team gets into the playoffs because that's good experience for the young players on the roster, and it's a reward for the veterans on that roster. But honestly, the Colts never belonged in this postseason. It was a pipe dream to begin with. If they'd gotten there, they would have been out, pretty easy out probably in the first round. But you don't know that, and that's why you want to get into the playoffs. But let's break down some statistics real quick for Joe Flacco. 26 of 38, 330 yards, had a couple of touchdowns. The first, he had 2 interceptions. One was at the beginning of the game. One was near the end of the game. He also got sacked a couple of times and lost a fumble. Jonathan Taylor, 32 carries. They really rode him again this week. 125 yards, 3.9 average per carry. 2 touchdowns. He did have a 26-yard touchdown run. It was pretty tough sledding for Jonathan Taylor, and I think that's probably the one thing that's really noticeable from when Richardson's a quarterback to whether Flacco's a quarterback or Minshew's a quarterback or whomever. When you have to account for Richardson, that does make life a little bit easier for Jonathan Taylor. Some really nice games from the wide receivers. 6 catches for 122 yards, a long of 49 for Alec Pierce. He had a touchdown grab as well. 9 catches for 109 yards and a touchdown from Michael Pittman Jr. And Pitt he's had a tough season. It's been a rough year for him. He's been dealing with an injury, a persistent back issue that at one point they thought would put him on the injured reserve, and it ended up not. He played through it, and this was his sharpest game of the year. Carlin Granson popped a couple of plays, 3 catches for 34 yards. Adonai Mitchell continues to befuddle. He was open in the end zone on a pass that was high, and then seemed to be a little upset at Joe Flacco for throwing the ball a little too high. It just wasn't catchable. The thing is, earlier in the game, Mitchell, you had a chance to make a big play on a ball that was catchable, and you let it go right through your hands. I'm kind of tired of that guy, mostly because you see the potential from him. He gets separation from guys, but he just can't come up with a big play on a consistent basis. Josh Downs not used as much this week as I thought perhaps he would be. 3 catches, 22 yards, just on 4 targets for him. So not a particularly stellar game from that perspective. But Josh Downs has been a steady wide receiver all season for the Colts. 14 tackles for Zaire Franklin. He led the team. After that, it was Nick Cross with 7. Felt like the linebackers, middle of the line, safeties missed a lot of tackles in this game. And it was pretty discouraging for the Colts. They lost the turnover battle. They were -3 in this one, if I'm recalling correctly, because they did not force a single turnover against the Giants. And that's kind of been the defense's saving grace. When you're playing the style of the defense that the Colts are, you're going to give up yards. Typically, you're not going to give up a bunch of explosive plays, although this week that's exactly what they did. They gave up a ton of explosive plays, like 5 or 6 of them this week. But typically, you're going to give up yardage. You're going to make the other team's offense be perfect. And in that perfection, you're hoping for disruption, sacks, fumbles, tipped balls that lead to interceptions. You shut them down in the red zone. Colts did none of that this week. They did win time of possession, which is one of the few times they've done that this week. They had it 33-23 to 26-37 this week. But, they allowed, they were bad on third down efficiency. On defense, they gave up 7 of 13. They were decent on third down efficiency. They were also 7 of 13 on the offensive side of things. They ran more plays than the Giants. They had more yards than the Giants, but the Giants were better on yards per play, and the Giants were essentially more efficient on offense. Plus, you kind of handed them, you handed them some points on a kickoff return to open the second half. And, what a different game it would have been if they had been able to cover that kick, right? And what if Matt Gay had hit that field goal? And then they had a chance to tie the game late and missed the 2-point conversion when they ran a little hook and ladder, and Jonathan Taylor, again, forgot how to catch the ball. So as many good things as you see from Taylor, there are some of those moments where you're just like, man, what is going on with you? But the long and short of it is, for Colts fans, I don't know. Will we see a seismic change in the offseason? We got 1 week left. The best the Colts can do is 8-9. Very entirely possible they finish 7-10 this season, because Jacksonville's never a sure thing anymore. At least it is at home, I guess. That's a little bit better for the Colts. But, just what is this franchise going to look like in the offseason? Are they going to make any major changes? I think defensively they've got to do something different, because if the Colts gave up a lot of yardage, but they held other teams down in terms of points, that would be acceptable. You could live with that. And you got the turnovers, right? You could live with that. But they're not getting pressure on the quarterback. They were against a mistake-prone offense this week and could not produce a single turnover. They had a couple of close calls, but they were unable to secure the ball to get some turnovers. One of them went out of bounds. They created a fumble and the ball bounced out of bounds. And so it's just one of those deals. I think they've got to make changes there. They may have to look at the coaching position as well, which is a shocking thing to say after last season. I thought Steichen came in and brought some real steadiness and determination to the team and showed a lot of resiliency. But if the team is this checked out in the most important game of the year at that point, it's hard to say, whether or not he sticks around. And then you've got to really look closely at the front office. So, listen, this is just my opinion on things. Maybe you've got a different opinion on them. That's fine. Maybe it is a fire everyone mentality. And if that is your call, if that's your determination on it, absolutely fine. Maybe it's give Ballard one more year, see how Anthony Richardson shakes out, with a full off season where he doesn't have to worry about recovering from a shoulder surgery. Maybe you're fair-minded enough to do that too. Also fine. But the long and short of it is the Colts have got to make some changes, because the culture there, and they talk about culture and all that stuff, it's not working. Because if this team had the culture that they like to pretend that they have, then this team comes out firing on all cylinders against the Giants, They shut down a very bad offensive football team, and they're alive for one more week in the playoffs. Instead, they're done. The season is over from a competition standpoint. The Colts have nothing more to play for except for maybe some personal accolades. Maybe Richardson can come in if he plays next week and complete 60% of his passes. Maybe that's what you have to look forward to against the Jacksonville Jaguars. But anyway, we will talk at length about this game, the embarrassment that is brought on the franchise yet again, and where the Colts go forward when Mike and Dave and I all get together and powwow. Until then, for the Colts Blue Zone podcast, I'm Matt Adams. Happy New Year, everybody.